Do you remember the last time you truly trusted someone? I'm not asking because I want you to answer. I'm asking because I want you to feel it. That sensation when you place all your trust in someone, and they use that very trust to stab you in the back. That is the story of a crime boss, but it is also your story, mine, and that of anyone who has ever misplaced their trust. The person who saved that crime boss was a 9-year-old girl living under a bridge. She refused his money, not because she didn't need it. She was hungry, cold, and holding her dying younger brother. But she still said no, because she knew, when you take money from a bad person, you owe them your soul. She demanded food instead, and with that request, a 9-year-old girl changed the fate of a crime boss. 15 years later, she walked into the courtroom where he stood on the verge of ruin, and she said no again. No to the fabricated verdict. She arrived with a brown leather briefcase. Inside was the truth that had been buried for 15 years. With that truth, she didn't just save him. She saved them both. Some debts are not paid in cash. They are paid in silence, in loyalty, and in a leather briefcase passing through a courtroom door that no one thought would ever open. If you think a 9-year-old girl cannot change a crime boss's destiny, you haven't met someone who spent 15 years preparing for a single moment. Chapter 1 begins right now, where a crumbling bridge under the rain and a stubborn street child change everything. That November cold didn't just seep into your bones. It interrogated you. It found every loose thread in your coat, every crack in your will, and asked what on earth you were doing outside at 2 a.m. Vikram Sinha wasn't out by chance. People in his position rarely are. He had come to the Howrah Bridge to meet a supplier who suddenly developed an inconvenient conscience regarding a shipment. The meeting ended the way such meetings usually did for Vikram. Quietly, permanently, and without much drama. But what he didn't expect as he walked back to his car with his coat collar turned up against the wind was the sound of a child trying very hard not to cry. And failing with dignity. Under the bridge, wedged into the concrete shadows where the wind couldn't reach, sat a girl no older than 9, holding a smaller boy tight. She looked up at Vikram with a gaze that shouldn't exist on such a childlike face. It wasn't exactly fear. It was an appraisal. She was doing the math, calculating whether he was a threat, and if so, what her options were. And judging by the way she positioned her body between him and her brother, there was exactly one option. Fight. Vikram knelt down. I won't hurt you. That was the sentence every dangerous man in history had used to start a conversation. She didn't move. We don't need anything. He remained kneeling, close enough to see that her brother's lips had turned the color of the concrete around them. He pulled out a folded stack of bills and held it toward her. She looked at the money as if he had just offered her a live snake. We don't need money. We need food. Real food. Not the kind you give to beggars so you can feel like a good person and go home. Vikram, a man who once sent a business partner for a trip off a yacht in the middle of the ocean just for a rounding error in a cargo declaration, for the first time in 10 years, found himself without a scripted response. Before he could find one, 2 men appeared around the path under the bridge. The opportunistic kind, the kind that preyed on scenes exactly like this. Because from a distance, it looked like an easy transaction. One man reached for the girl's arm. Vikram moved before conscious thought could catch up with him. Within 10 seconds, both men were on the ground, groaning, reconsidering a few of life's choices. It wasn't heroism, it was the muscle memory of heroism. The girl watched the entire incident without flinching, recording it as just another fact about the strange man in front of her. You aren't a good person. It wasn't an accusation. Just an observation, delivered the way you might note the weather. No, Vikram agreed. I am not. Her brother's breathing had become shallow and wet-sounding. Vikram, against every instinct that had kept him alive and wealthy for 30 years, picked the boy up himself and carried him to the car. The girl followed 3 steps behind, refusing to let the distance between them shrink to 2. The hospital did what it could, but it wasn't enough. 3 days later, in a hallway smelling of antiseptic and bad decisions, a doctor delivered the news that never arrives without warning and never leaves without mercy. Pneumonia. Too severe, too long untreated. No one knows to look for a dying boy under a bridge. That is the whole point of bridges. The girl didn't cry in front of anyone. Vikram only knew she had because he found her later. In a stairwell, dry-eyed and angry in the specific way of someone determined not to be caught grieving. He offered no comfort. He made a decision instead. You're coming home with me. I don't need charity. This isn't charity. Charity is something people do to feel better about themselves. This is a mistake I am choosing to make on purpose. For the first time, something not quite a smile flickered across her face. That is the most honest thing you have said. Her name, she told him in the car, was Kavya. His men, when they heard the news, guessed poisoning, extortion, or a stroke. No one guessed the truth, that somewhere under a bridge, in the midst of arranging a man's disappearance, Vikram Sinha had acquired something he absolutely did not know how to survive. A daughter who would spend her entire childhood informing him, in increasingly sophisticated language, that everything he built was built wrong. He had no way of knowing it, but he had just made the only deal in his career that he would never be able to walk away from. Kavya's first year in the Sinha household felt less like an adoption, and more like a prolonged struggle, conducted mostly in silence and increasingly sharp remarks at the dinner table. The mansion seemed designed to intimidate. The marble floors were polished to a hostile degree. The art on the walls was worth more than most people's homes, and the staff moved through the rooms as if they had been trained never to be noticed. Kavya noticed it all. She recorded the number of guards standing at doors that were supposedly leading to unimportant places. She noticed how conversations stopped when she entered certain rooms. She noticed that her father's new business associates wore very nice suits and very nervous smiles. She was 11 years old when she finally talked about it. "You launder money in the East Wing," she stated at dinner, the way another child might state a fact about dinosaurs. "That import consulting firm, it doesn't consult anything. I looked it up myself." Vikram set his chopsticks down with the peculiar caution of a man buying time to think. That is a very serious accusation for someone who still needs help reaching things on high shelves. "I don't need help. I use a stool, and it's not an accusation, it's an observation," she continued eating. Not only that single phrase damaged his composure more than any threat from a rival boss ever had. He reacted the way he reacted to most things that unsettled him, by throwing resources at the problem until the discomfort resolved itself. He hired tutors, then better tutors. When she outgrew them, he found professors willing to teach a precocious child advanced knowledge for sums that made even his accountant blink. He told himself it was about opportunity. But if he were honest with himself late at night, which he rarely was, it was about something closer to atonement, though he couldn't name what it was. By the age of 14, Kavya had memorized enough of the country's penal code to make his lawyers look nervous when she attended meetings she hadn't been invited to. She stood at the threshold, arms crossed over her chest, dismantling arguments with the calm precision of someone who had already won, and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. "Father's business model," she told him one evening, apropos of nothing while doing homework at his desk instead of her own, "is morally decadent. And it's also just a bad long-term strategy. Empires built on fear collapse as soon as the fear disappears. You should read some history books." "I have read history," Vikram said. "That is exactly why I run things the way I do." "Then you read it wrong." He should have been angry. Any of his henchmen would have paid for that insolence, with more than just a stern look. Instead, he found himself fighting something dangerously close to pride, and immediately buried it because pride was a liability in a house full of men waiting for weakness. She called him father from the second year onwards, though the word carried a sharp edge, less affection and more accountability, as if the title itself were a contract she intended to make him honor. It was around this time that Arjun Mehta entered the family's inner circle in earnest. Soft-spoken, impeccably polite, the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday and never raised his voice. Vikram trusted him the way he trusted very few people, completely and without question, which was exactly the kind of rot from within that no one smells until it is too late. Kavya did not trust him at all. "He agrees with you too much," she once told her father, watching Arjun through a cracked office door. "That is called loyalty. That is called strategy. Loyal people sometimes disagree with you." "He never does." Vikram brushed it off as the suspicion of adolescence. He had an empire to run, shipments to move, rivals to manage, and a growing insecurity he refused to name, whenever Arjun smiled too warmly at the right moment. Somewhere in the machinery of that empire, quietly, patiently, over more years than weeks, Arjun Mehta had begun to divert funds through companies with names so boring no one thought to question them. Shell companies, money laundering accounts disguised as legal imports. Every transaction was engineered to point ultimately in one direction: Vikram. Kavya finished her final tutoring program at 17 with academic achievements that should have opened doors to any university in the world. Instead, she made a request that unsettled her father more than any threat ever had. "I want to study abroad. Somewhere far. Somewhere with real courts and real laws. Not the version you bought." He should have refused. He should have kept her close, kept her safe, kept her right where he could see her. Instead, for reasons he would not fully understand until 15 years later in a courtroom filled with cameras, he said yes. Kavya left 3 weeks after her 18th birthday, carrying 2 suitcases and a silence that Vikram mistook at the time for reverse homesickness. A girl relieved to finally put an ocean between herself and everything she had grown up witnessing. He was wrong, though he would not understand how wrong until a decade and a half later. What he knew in the years that followed came in fragments. A law degree from a university that didn't return his calls when he tried to donate a new library wing. A name that no longer appeared on any registry he could access. The silence where updates used to be. He told himself she was building a life. He told himself this was what he wanted for her. He told his men when they asked that his daughter was handling her own business, which was true in a way none of them understood. Back in Mumbai, the empire had developed a slow leak that no one could pinpoint. It started small, a shipping declaration that didn't match by a few million rupees, brushed aside as an administrative error. Then, a partner in Surat, who used to be reliable, suddenly stopped answering the phone. Then, an audit, requested quietly by a rival gang looking to expand into Sinha territory, uncovered specific financial irregularities, so perfectly documented that they could only have been created by someone who understood the business from the inside. Vikram brought the discrepancies to the only man he trusted enough to handle them. "Someone has been careless," Arjun said, examining the documents with the calm, unhurried interest of a doctor giving results for a test he already knew the answer to. "I will handle it quietly. You have enough on your plate already." Vikram trusted him. That is the tragedy of loyalty built without verification. It functions exactly as the person exploiting it needs it to function. Over the next 2 years, the leak became a flood. Shell companies with names like Mahadev Trading Solutions and Kanpur Import Partners appeared in files, each traced, eventually and inevitably, to accounts bearing Vikram's signature, a signature that Arjun had spent a decade learning to forge with the patience of a man who always intended to use it. Loyal captains who were once willing to take bullets for the boss began finding reasons to avoid eye contact in the hallways. Fear, once Vikram's greatest asset, had started to turn against him because fear cannot distinguish between a besieged boss and a boss who has become the siege itself. It was during this slow disintegration that Kavya stopped responding entirely. No calls, no emails, no explanations, just an absence that expanded by degrees until it became permanent. And the tabloids filled the silence the way tabloids always do, with cruelty disguised as insight. Even his own daughter couldn't stand him, one headline read, accompanied by a photo of Vikram looking older than his years, standing outside a courthouse for an unrelated matter, looking exactly like the villain the story needed him to be. His men expected him to hunt her down. He had crossed oceans for people who had insulted him at parties. Surely he would move heaven and earth for a daughter who had vanished without a word. He moved nothing at all. "She has the right to leave without being hunted," he told the only lieutenant who dared to ask. It was not resignation. It was the closest thing to respect that he knew how to show. The same respect she had demanded from him under the bridge 15 years earlier when she refused his money and said exactly what she needed instead. What none of them knew, what would not surface until a Mumbai courtroom was filled with cameras, and the prosecutor had already tasted victory, was that Kavya had not run away from her father's world. She had gone to study a language sharp enough to destroy it. Every year of silence, every unanswered call, was spent in law libraries, in courtrooms, observing systems that her father's version of justice had never touched, building piece by patient piece a weapon unique enough to survive what was coming. She found the first shell company 2 years after disappearing, buried in a file she had pulled entirely out of habit, the same habit that once led her to log the guards at doors that led to nowhere. The name meant nothing to anyone else. To her, trained from childhood to pay attention to exactly this kind of boring, intentional camouflage, it meant everything. She did not call her father. Calling meant having to explain, and explaining too soon meant losing the element that made her useful. No one, least of all Arjun Mehta, expected the missing daughter to be the one holding the folder that would end him. By the time the Mumbai prosecutor filed formal charges against Vikram Sinha, charges built on evidence so clean it should have raised suspicion in anyone actually looking, Kavya had spent 3 years quietly extracting records from 4 countries under a name the tabloids never bothered to track. She was no longer hiding. She was targeting. On the early morning of the verdict, the Central Mumbai District Court was full 2 hours before the doors officially opened. Reporters fought for seats like it was a concert. Members of rival gangs sat in the audience, not bothering to hide their satisfaction, dressed for the occasion, as if they had been invited to a funeral they had organized themselves. Vikram Sinha sat at the defense table in a suit that no longer fit him the way it used to. Not physically, but in the way clothes stop fitting a man who has spent months absorbing every blow without any way to strike back. Across the aisle, the lead prosecutor reviewed his notes one last time, with the relaxed thoroughness of a man checking a bag he already knew was packed. The bills of lading were entered as evidence. The money laundering accounts were meticulously documented. The forged signatures had been verified by an expert witness, who spoke with the flat confidence of someone who had never suspected anyone could have taught Arjun how to forge it so well in the first place. Vikram's legal team had run out of angles 2 weeks ago. His lead counsel, a competent man under normal circumstances, had the distinct pallor of someone preparing to lose gracefully because losing was the only option left on the table. It was at this moment, with the evidence piled high, the verdict all but written, and the cameras angled for the shot that would define the next news cycle, that the courtroom door opened. Kavya walked in. She was not the girl who had disappeared. She moved like someone who had built an entirely new person over the past years. Sharp suit, sharper posture, a single leather briefcase held as if it were far heavier than paper. The room did not recognize her immediately. Vikram did, in the half-second before his mind caught up with his eyes, the way a body remembers a person before the brain can process the shock. "My daughter," he whispered. And for the first time in 30 years, a few reporters in the front row witnessed the composure of Vikram Sinha crack in a way no legal pressure ever had. Kavya approached the judge's bench with the calmness of someone who had rehearsed this moment more times than she was willing to admit. "Your Honor, I request to be admitted as co-counsel for the defense. I have new evidence directly related to the charges before this court." The prosecution objected. The judge, though curious despite herself, allowed it, partly out of procedure, partly out of simple human curiosity to know exactly what was in that briefcase. What followed over the next 2 hours dismantled the prosecution's case with the patience of someone who had spent a decade building for exactly this. The accountants Kavya had retained years earlier testified about discrepancies in the forged signatures too subtle for the original defense team to detect. Bank records from 3 countries, obtained through channels the prosecution didn't know to close, revealed the true origins of the shell companies. Not Vikram's signature, but a decade-long pattern that traced back to a single familiar name. Arjun Mehta, sitting in the audience as a witness for the prosecution, watched his own architecture collapse in real time. The prosecutor, sensing the ground shifting beneath a case he had been certain of an hour ago, asked for a recess. The judge refused. "We will finish today," she said, and something in her tone suggested that she, too, sensed the room had become much more interesting than anyone had prepared for. Kavya set the briefcase down, opening to a single page, a bank transfer dated 2 years before the first fake declaration appeared, sent from an account in Arjun Mehta's real name to a shell company he had assumed no one could trace back that far. "This is where it began," she said, loud enough for the cameras to hear, calm enough that it fell like a verdict already rendered. "Not with my father, but with him." Arjun Mehta's face, for the first time in 30 years of practicing pleasantry, showed something the room had never seen from him before. Panic, unfiltered and entirely real. Arjun had spent 2 decades perfecting the art of staying calm under pressure. It was the exact skill that had made him valuable to Vikram, the unflappable lieutenant, soft-spoken, never loud, never showing his hand, never giving anyone a reason to look twice. That skill deserted him completely the moment Kavya's transfer appeared on the courtroom's projection screen. "That document is a forgery," he said, rising from his seat before his lawyer could stop him, "just like the rest of this theater." "It has been notarized in 3 jurisdictions," Kavya replied without raising her voice, which somehow made the accusation hit harder than if she had shouted. "Would you like to explain to the court why your signature appears on a shell company account 2 years before my father's alleged crimes began?" The courtroom, which had arrived with the expectation of a quiet procedure and a predictable ending, fell completely silent. The specific silence of several hundred people, simultaneously realizing they were witnessing something that would be replayed on every news channel in the country by evening. The judge called for order. Arjun did not sit down. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said, and for the first time, the mask of total, gentle loyalty slipped away, revealing something colder underneath. Something that seemed to have been there the whole time, patiently waiting for an opportunity that had finally, disastrously, arrived. "You think you saved him? You've painted a target on both of your backs." It was in the years that followed, the moment played most frequently in the endless documentaries and retrospectives after the trial. The second Arjun lunged toward the bailiff's desk, his hand reaching for a weapon he had no legal right to touch. 30 years of composure exploded on live camera. Vikram's instincts, honed through 3 decades of exactly this type of moment, moved before his conscious mind could keep up. He was already halfway out of his seat, every muscle ready to do what he had always done when someone threatened what belonged to him. End it permanently with the calm efficiency of a man who had made this exact decision hundreds of times before. Kavya stepped between them, not toward Arjun, but toward her father. "Not like this," she said, her hand placed flat against his chest, her voice calm in a way that suggested she had imagined this exact moment more times than she was willing to admit. "Not anymore." The bailiffs had subdued Arjun within seconds. In the end, it wasn't much of a struggle, just a desperate man making a final, poorly considered choice before a captive audience that would ensure it followed him for the rest of his life. But the moment that mattered, the moment the cameras caught and replayed for weeks, was not the arrest of Arjun Mehta. It was Vikram Sinha, hand still raised toward a threat he would have eliminated, without a second thought, a year earlier, instead lowering it. Not because he had been overwhelmed, but because his daughter had asked him to. For the first time in 30 years, he chose her rules over his own instincts. The courtroom took another 20 minutes to fully settle. Once it had, the judge, who was recalibrating the entire expectations of a day, ordered a formal review of the newly presented evidence, with clear signals about the direction that review was likely to go. Vikram said nothing until the recess, alone with Kavya in a side room too small for the weight of everything they had not said in 15 years. "You built all of this," he said, not as a question. "I built it because you were the only mistake I deliberately made that I didn't let go to waste," she said, repeating almost verbatim what he had said to her under the bridge a lifetime ago. "You said it wasn't charity. It was a decision. This is mine." He looked at her, really looked, in a way he hadn't allowed himself during the years she was gone, searching for the terrified girl under the bridge in the composed woman standing before him, and seeing her still there, beneath everything, exactly where she had always been. "I didn't come to save your empire," she added, softer now. "I came to save you from it." The verdict came 4 days later, though by then it had become a formality, the legal equivalent of a coroner confirming what everyone in the room already knew. Vikram Sinha was acquitted of all charges related to false filings and money laundering accounts. Arjun Mehta, facing a completely different set of charges now, sat in a courtroom with significantly fewer cameras and far less sympathy than he had once had. The empire, however, did not simply return to what it once was. That, Kavya had made clear within hours of the verdict, was never an option. "You are free," she told her father. Both sat in his office for the first time in 15 years. The room was somehow smaller than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply grown larger than the fear that once filled it. "That doesn't mean you get to go back to exactly what you once were. I built that business over 30 years. You built an empire on fear and nearly executed an innocent man underneath it," she said. "I just spent 4 years destroying the case against you. I have no interest in letting the rest of it stand." He should have argued. Every instinct that had kept him alive and wealthy for 3 decades told him to argue, to remind her whose name was on the ownership papers, whose decisions had built the house she was sitting in. Instead, he found himself doing something he had done perhaps twice in his entire adult life. Listening, really listening to someone tell him he was wrong. In the months that followed, the transition happened piece by piece, each piece smaller and more mundane than the courtroom drama that had preceded it, which is how actual, real change works, not in a single cinematic gesture, but in a series of decisions no one outside the family saw. The shipping lines once used to move product no one wanted tracked were quietly diverted into legitimate logistics contracts. The shell companies that had spent years laundering money became, clumsily at first, and then with real purpose, genuine businesses, employing people who had no idea the payroll they depended on had once existed entirely as camouflage. The captains who had avoided Vikram's eyes in the hallway during the trial found themselves facing a different kind of challenge entirely. Whether they could survive in an organization no longer based on fear. Some could not. They left or were encouraged with generous severance packages sufficient to buy their silence without the threats that once accompanied them. Others stayed, finding, some with visible discomfort, that loyalty built on respect required significantly more effort than loyalty built on intimidation and yielded. Against every instinct Vikram had trusted for decades, significantly better results. Kavya did not take a role in the new organization. She insisted on that point with the same stubbornness she once used to refuse a stack of cash under the bridge. "This is not mine to run," she told him. "It is yours to fix. I will help you build the structure. I will not be the one keeping it." What she did take was the foundation, the community trust established with the proceeds from the empire's legal conversion, funding legal centers and clinics across Mumbai. All were built intentionally without the Sinha name attached to a single building or program. "People should trust the work," she told a reporter when asked why, "not the name that paid for it." The press, for their part, struggled with what to do with a story that refused to fit the shape they had spent 15 years building. The Shadow King of Mumbai didn't have an obvious next chapter for a man who now spent his Tuesdays reviewing grant applications for a legal clinic instead of cargo manifests for products that didn't exist. Some journalists attempted skepticism. Surely this was reputation management. Surely there was a hidden angle. Most eventually simply stopped trying to explain and let the centers, clinics, and employment figures speak for themselves. Vikram, for his part, found the adaptation more difficult than any hostile takeover he had ever survived. Power built on fear, at least, was simple. Power built on accountability required him to sit through meetings where people disagreed with him and weren't punished for it, a novelty that took significantly longer to stop feeling like a threat. "You're getting better at this every month," Kavya told him one evening, reviewing quarterly reports at his desk, much like she used to as a teenager. minus the accusation that had colored every conversation back then. "I have a very difficult teacher," he said. For the first time in either of their memories, he meant it as a compliment, and she received it as one. Winter returned to Mumbai the way it always returned, unapologetic, unannounced, cracking concrete and testing coats just as it had 15 years prior. The Howrah Bridge looked like it always looked. Gray, nondescript, the kind of place people passed without a second glance, which was exactly why it had once hidden a girl and her little brother perfectly from a city that should have found them sooner. Vikram Sinha stood beneath it, now older coat collar turned up against a wind that seemed less hostile than it once had, or perhaps he had simply stopped needing it to be an enemy. Beside him, Kavya set down a food box, the way they had done every winter since the trial, a small ritual that had begun as her insistence and became, over the years, something he actually looked forward to rather than simply endured. "You don't have to keep doing this," she said, watching him arrange the box with more care than the task actually required. "Neither do you," he said, and yet, she smiled, a rare thing undefensive that still caught him off guard after all these years, a reminder of exactly how much had changed since a 9-year-old child had looked at him under this same bridge and calmly informed him he wasn't a good person. "I was wrong, you know," she said. "That first night I said you weren't a good person. I am not wrong." "You were wrong," she said. "You just hadn't seen the rest of the equation." The empire behind them, smaller than it once was, legalized, stripped of the fear that had once been its foundation, had stabilized into something that neither of them could have predicted 15 years ago. The foundation that Kavya built now funds 11 centers across the city, 3 legal clinics, and a scholarship program quietly responsible for putting more children through university than the tabloids have ever reported. Mostly because a redemption story without a villain to sneer at makes for significantly less compelling headlines. Arjun Mehta's trial ended months ago. A sentence long enough to ensure that the loyalty he had feigned for 30 years would finally cost him something real. Vikram had, in the intervening months, discovered an uncomfortable truth about the life he had rebuilt. It was harder, by almost every measurable metric, than the life he had abandoned. Fear had been efficient. Accountability was slow, argumentative, and sometimes humiliating in meetings where the captains he once controlled with a single glance now felt entitled to disagree with him in front of one another. It was also, he had come to admit somewhere around the second year, the first version of his life that actually allowed him to sleep. "I once thought strength meant no one could challenge me," he said, watching a group of children cross the bridge above them, unaware of the two standing in the cold below. "You taught me that it means being challenged and still choosing to listen." "I didn't teach you that," Kavya said. "You taught yourself. I just kept showing up until you ran out of excuses not to listen." They stood in silence for a moment, the kind that used to be a battlefield between them, and had gradually, over 15 years, become something closer to peace. "Same time next winter?" she asked finally. "Same time every winter," he said, "as long as there is a bridge standing." They left the food where they always left it, not as a symbolic gesture, not as an act of penance for a past neither of them could redo, but as a simple practical answer to a simple practical need. The same answer that Kavya had demanded of him the first night they met. Somewhere under another bridge in another part of the city, another child might be cold tonight, might be hungry, might be doing the same silent calculations that Kavya once did, deciding if the stranger in front of them is a threat or, against all reasonable expectations, an incredible second chance. Compassion, it turns out, is not the soft, sentimental thing the tabloids like to mock. It is a strategy. Patient, deliberate, compound interest paid out over 15 years, one decision at a time, until a homeless girl under a bridge and the man who once struck fear into an entire city had together built something significantly stronger than fear or mere forgiveness. It is simply the only kind of empire that truly lasts. Finally, there is one thing I want you to truly reflect on after this story ends. We often think that power is no one being able to hurt you. We think success is accumulating enough so that no one can shake you. But this story teaches me a different lesson. True strength is when someone can hurt you, can betray you, can challenge you, and you still choose to open your heart. You still choose to listen. You still choose to believe that people can change. Kavya didn't save Vikram with the law. She saved him by showing him a different path, by showing up day after day, year after year, and refusing to let him be his old self. And that is what I want you to take with you after this video. Sometimes the person who saves you is not the strongest. Sometimes it is the most patient, the one who shows up every day, the one who refuses to give up on you, even when you have given up on yourself. That is the only kind of strength that truly exists. And that is the only kind of empire worth building. If you found this story meaningful, share it with a friend who needs to be reminded that change is possible. Thank you for listening.